a conversation with Paul Soglin on June 28th, 1984. This conversation will cover, and we hope when it's finished, the entire career of Paul Soglin to this date, which started in Madison when he arrived here as a freshman student in 1962. Is that
right?
Okay, now, I'm not going to ask you very many questions. I would rather you just rattled on.
Okay, all right.
And whatever things you've been thinking about now.
Well, I suppose the first thing is why I came to Madison. I was in high school in the Chicago suburbs, and like all high school students looking for a place to go to school, had a number of criteria for what was important in terms of college, one of which was being in the Midwest. Family wanted me to be at least close enough to home that I was accessible and could get back and forth quickly. Another thing was to go to a school that was excellent academically, that was in at least a city large enough to be a city. I didn't want to be in a place that was isolated, where it was a campus in a small town and the campus completely dominated the city. And the other thing, which certainly had an effect, was political activity. I wanted to be at a school that there were things happening, and part of that.
One of those.
That was, well, it didn't. Madison certainly had that history. The state did. And another factor was I did not want to be in an ROTC program. And Wisconsin was probably the only state university in the whole United States at that time that did not have compulsory ROTC for its students. Here at Madison, students were required to go to a 5-hour introduction to ROTC, but were not required to take 1 or 2 years of ROTC as a regular course as they were at other schools. And that was partially a reflection of the faculty having debated the issue back in, I guess it was the 50s. And
it was debated when I was a student in 1934. There was always an effort to make it compulsory.
And that was, to me, a reflection of values that were important in a university, that the university did not want to be part of mandatory military training. And so all those things pointed to Wisconsin. Let's see, it was September 1962 that I came up here.
You came with many North Shore Chicago students.
At that time, well, from my high school alone, there were, I think, 16 of us from Highland Park High School, and there were probably as many from other North Shore schools, and that number was actually to substantially grow. I remember that by about 65 or 66, our high school sent over 40 students. I think it was 44 just in 1 year.
Illinois and Champaign-Urbana got rather tough to get into, even for residents of Illinois. I remember.
But there was a lot of us didn't want to go to school in Illinois. It was viewed as being a very drab, boring place. That the engineering and technical campuses dominated to the point where culturally and politically and socially there just was not a lot going on. That in terms of a liberal education, Wisconsin was a far superior place. And in retrospect, I certainly think that was true.
Can I stop you? When you came, did you go into the dorms like all the other freshman kids?
I lasted in the dorms for 2 weeks. I was out in the dorms, and I just really didn't like it. In the meantime, a number of friends were living in a rooming house over on Henry Street, and there was a vacancy there. The dorms were overcrowded that year, so I had no trouble getting out of my dorm contract, and I made the switch over to the rooming house. I really don't know if that was a good idea or not in retrospect, because the next year I did not do particularly well academically. My parents thought maybe if I'd stayed in the dorms with more supervision, I would have done better, but there really wasn't that much supervision in the dorms.
Supervision was a little...
But part of the problem also was that I was also just so far from everything. All of my classes were on Bascom Hill. I spent a lot of time at the Union. All my friends lived somewhere in the Langdon or Gilman Street areas, and I was out in the Lakeshore dorms, and so that's why I made the switch. But dorm life lasted for about 2 weeks.
Well, in any case, you had the experience of living in a dorm.
But the rooming house, I would not call that, let's put it this way, if my child was living in a rooming house under those circumstances, I'd be concerned about how much time they were spending studying, how much time they were sleeping. We were not a particularly good group of students, let's put it that way. And we were not good influences on one another.
It was all male, I guess.
It was all male. We had house parents. They were graduate students who were really too preoccupied with their own studies to worry about us. And we were...
Were you all freshmen?
That was another part of the problem. I think except for 2 out of the some 25 living in the rooming house, we were all freshmen. And that probably had a lot to do with it. But somehow I made it through that first year. I was probably the only one in that group that was really had any political interests. Everybody had a lot of social interests. A lot of the fellows were interested in fraternities or were members of fraternities. And that stereotype that comes out of the movie Animal House, in terms of, we go to school long enough to pass our exams, or study long enough to pass our exams and stay in school, and the rest of the time is one big party, pretty much held. Now, my political activity was really rather limited. I think I went to a Friends of SNCC meeting a few times. And I began to meet some people who were involved in, can't remember the names now, the Student Peace Union and so on. Mostly from spending time at the student union, but I really wasn't doing all that much. The following year, I moved to another rooming house off of Francis next to the Broad House, and there we had a better balance. My roommate was a medical student, but he wasn't the greatest influence in the world either. He ended up flunking out medical school.
That must be hard to do. It's so hard to get in. I don't imagine anybody funks out.
Well, he worked hard at it. He worked hard at it. And my parents, of course, thought this was going to be wonderful. Here I am my sophomore year now, and I've got a roommate who's a medical student. Now we're going to seriously get down to business. Unfortunately for me, the week of registration, I got mononucleosis and ended up in the hospital for about the first 2-3 weeks of the semester, and then basically spent the rest of the semester sleeping.
Yeah,
so that I actually, what I should have done was dropped out of school.
You tried to take your exams?
But I dropped one or two courses, and somehow I made it through. And then it was actually the second semester of my sophomore year that I began to really see the campus and see the city. Feeling better, I had more time.
You were not working during this
And
time.
that second semester I actually went out and I also got a job. I had a number of jobs. I was a potato tester at the home economics department. They had advertised they needed students to sample mashed potatoes, and I did
That's a
that
good way
for
to put on a
about.
little weight.
They didn't give us a lot.
Mm.
They gave us a lot of different ones, but not a lot in terms of quantity. We didn't know what they were doing at the time, but it turned out what we were eating all that 2-3 months was what are now mashed potatoes out of the box.
Mm.
They were experimenting with pre-mixed mashed potatoes, which was not
Dehydrated.
Dehydrated, that's what it was. And we must have tasted 30, 40 different formulas and mixtures. And then I became through my junior year, I became the evening switchboard operator for the university. I mean, at that time, the University Central information number was staffed by 3-4 people during the day up in office in Bascom Hall, and in the evening they had one student doing it. And I would do it from 5 till 10 during the week until midnight on the weekends.
Every day?
And I think it was only 3 nights or 4 nights a week.
Oh.
And I felt I
You
was at
could
the
study while you were
command
there.
center of the university.
Yes, I remember trying to get answers out of that office
I
occasionally.
mean, now it's a whole computerized, modern equipment. This was just old-fashioned
This
telephone
is a
equipment.
job that you could study at.
Yes, and it was interesting because you really learned the social patterns of the university with that job. I could set my clock, if I wanted to, by how the phones rang. If I was working on a weekend, things would start picking up on a Friday or a Saturday. They'd start picking up about 4:30 or 5, as it would be mostly men calling, and they'd be wanting the numbers for their dates. Then things would be quiet over the dinner hour, and then around 6:30, 7:30, they'd start picking up again. Then it would be very quiet through the evening till about 11, 12 o'clock. And then fellows who were out at bars and looking for girls would start calling and trying to get telephone numbers and find out what happened to so-and-so. And they would stay pretty active then till close to bar time. And then it would drop off again. During the week, there'd hardly be any calls at all. You'd tell when people were studying. And as the week goes on, each night it would get busier and busier. As students are less likely to study on Wednesday than they did on Monday or Tuesday, or less likely to study on Thursday. But I learned a pattern of the frequency of the calls during the week and also during the time of day. So I held that job most of my junior year. But by that time, I'd gotten active with SNCC, and had also finally decided what I wanted to do, having dropped the sciences and the mathematics, and at that time I was taking a lot of courses in history and political science. And I remember that my first real venture was at the time of the March in Selma, when a number of us went out into Madison doing door-to-door canvassing and trying to raise money. And I didn't know it at the time, but I ended up in what was the Jennifer Spade Street area. Like most students, the real boundaries of the university or the city were the boundaries of the immediate streets around the university, and then the main streets out of town to get to Chicago or to get to Milwaukee.
That's another area which has been enormous change.
Yeah.
Students have moved out.
And, for example, at the time, the whole Hilldale shopping center and that whole area was under development. There were constantly articles in the paper about what the city was doing with the development of Hilldale and how it was coming along. I'd never been to Hilldale. I didn't know where Hilldale was, and I really didn't care.
Now it's sort of Central City.
But I remember at the time reading a lot of articles about how the Hilldale development was coming along and the controversies involved there. I really had no knowledge of the city other than the fact that the airport and Oscar Myers were on the east side. A lot of the university faculty lived on the west side, and that was about it. Then...
Did you go to Selma?
No, I did not go. And I remember, in fact, the buses from Madison never made it to Selma because state troopers in the southern states north of Alabama were not letting buses through. All the buses that were coming from the north. A lot of those buses, I remember, ended up going to Washington. But one or two buses did leave the Union, and the rest of us basically did go out doing that canvassing, and there were some demonstrations here in Madison.
It was a very important period, that Selma period. Made a terrific difference.
And that was probably the first real opportunity to see the city. And one of the things that was noticeable then, and which became more important, which really had a profound influence on me later on, was the relationship between what was going on campus and the rest of the city. Now, I remember it was in October of 1963. It was a month before President Kennedy was assassinated. There was a demonstration against American participation in Vietnam on the steps of the Union. And I remember there was a telegram from Congressman Kastenmeier, who at that time was already a hero for me. He had been one of the 5 members of Congress earlier who had fought the battle to stop the House Un-American Activities Committee. There was 5 of them at the time. It would take another 10 years until they were successful, 8 years. But anyway, most of the contacts I had, and I really don't even know who the people were at the time, dealt with the civil rights area. And it stayed that way until really we get into the draft demonstrations in 65 and 66. But in the meantime, there were some, what I think were profound changes happening on the campus, which nobody really understood what it meant in terms of changing the relationship of the city and the university, and not the least of which was the change in the university housing policies. That students no longer were required to stay in the dormitories or the approved university rooming houses. Now, at that time, only graduate students or students who were over 21 could live in their own apartment. And with that change coming in around 65 and 66, that really was later on had so many different effects. The effect of the students moving out into residential areas and the land use planning consequences of that, but also it would also bring students and non-students together closer on other issues. The kind of political issues that were going to dominate during the latter part of the 60s. And when I first decided to run for the city council, which was in 68, people were saying, why do that? What does that have to do with the war in Vietnam and so on? Well, 2 years earlier, those of us who were involved in student government at the university had formed a new campus political party. was called University Community Action. And the premise behind the party that made it different than all the other student political groups was that we were not just a campus organization. That, in effect, we realized that the things we were concerned about at the time, whether it had to deal with university housing policies, or city housing policies, or the war in Vietnam, or the draft, we realized that those were not issues that were limited to the university campus. Those were citywide issues. And that if we were going to see changes, if we were going to see changes in those issues and people's positions, the discussion had to go beyond the campus.
When did the 18-year-old vote come?
The 18-year-old vote was not until 670, I think. So it was still a 21-year-old vote.
But when it became 18, they could go into the dorms and
Well,
get a lot of people.
then the registration drives changed even more. But what happened was we began to well, for me, it goes back to the Dow demonstration in 1967. After the Dow demonstration,
That changed your
there
life
was,
considerably.
that had a very profound change. But more than the demonstration was the aftermath, where a church on Madison's northeast side wanted to have a discussion about what had happened. So they invited a number of people to come out and participate. We had a panel, and I really didn't understand the significance of all the people on the panel at the time, because this was, I guess, late October, early November of 1967. But on that panel was Dean Ginsburg, Police Inspector Herman Thomas, who I had no idea who he was, and a conservative Madison attorney, who I really didn't know at all, who folks had told me he'd run for mayor in 1966. It did not make it through the primary. No, it would have been the spring of 67. And that was Bill Dyke. So we were on this panel.
And were you the only student?
There might have been one other student. It was a church just off the corner of Sherman Avenue and Northport Drive on Sherman Avenue. But what struck me about that panel discussion and the questions we got was the tremendous gulf of information between the members of that congregation and those of us on the campus. I mean, they had absolutely no idea as to the intensity as to how we felt about the war in Vietnam, what the war meant. They had no more understanding of what was going on the university campus than they might have about some incident that happened on a campus in Mexico or in India.
That's right. Seemed a million miles away.
And so then that was what was so startling from them, that it happened right in their own city. And I was startled. If they were startled by what had happened, I was startled and surprised by how little they knew about what had been going on. I mean, there were all these meetings all the time, the Committee on the War in Vietnam. But we were really very self-contained, as it turned out. And so that just reinforced my own feelings that it was real important that there be this dialogue in effect. And I saw the city council and being an alderman as a way of accomplishing so many things at once.
Nobody had ever thought about the city council in those terms before.
Well, actually there had been one other person, at least, a fellow named Fred Marcus, who had planted the idea a year or two earlier with me. But I think his interest was a little different, where he just wanted to be on the city council. But when he had talked about running for the city council, it just kind of said to me, that's a great idea. we've got issues here in Madison that are of concern that are not just university issues. And this whole thing with housing was a perfect example. The city was in the position, not the university, of dealing with housing problems in apartments, the quality of housing, and that was a major concern. The police department was certainly under the control of the city. And if you assume that the leaders of the city are on the city council, by definition, what an excellent group to have a dialogue with, so they'll get a better understanding of what's going on.
But in those days, it was a naive idea to think that the city council was in charge of the city.
And, well, there were a lot of surprises.
Mm-hmm.
There were an awful lot of surprises. I think there were surprises all the way around. There were surprises that the other members of the council had when they found out that myself and later Gene Parks and Dennis McGilligan had interests that dealt with the city, though we weren't there just to talk about the war in Vietnam. I was surprised at the extremes at which some people went. Those who just totally dismissed me, dismissed Gene, and ignored us, and those people who wanted to listen. And the perfect example of that was the difference between Babe Rohr and Leo Cooper. Here were two fellows of the same generation with very common experiences coming out of organized labor. And Babe Rohr just really had nothing to do with us, didn't want to have anything to do with us, didn't want to listen to us. And Leo was always asking questions. Leo was not in a situation, Leo didn't say, well, it's just because it's coming from their mouths, it's not to be listened to. If there were real city concerns that we had, Leo was ready to work with us. And of course, the same thing was true of Ollie Ashman and Jan Wheeler.
Mm-hmm.
But in those instances, to me, it wasn't so startling because I expected that. Knowing who Ollie Ashman was, knowing the district she represented, the kind of interest she had before she came on the council, it wasn't surprising, as it was with Leo Cooper. And there were even some conservative members of the council. Bill Dries, who represented the 21st District at that time. Bill and I got along on very little. I remember when we had a council resolution supporting the grape boycott. He brought his own picket sign to the council meeting which said, "Eat grapes." And yet, in 70 and 71, when we were redistricting the councils, the aldermanic districts, Bill and I were the two who sat down and worked it out when nobody else wanted to do it.
It's too hard.
And it turned out, despite our political difference, there was something we were both committed to, which was following the one person, one vote mandate of the Supreme Court, and at the same time preserving the integrity as best we could of 22 neighborhood districts.
Could you back up just a second? You were elected to the council the first time you ran.
First time I ran when elected was 68, and
that
it was 21-year vote at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the two things that made the difference together was the fact that in that district, besides having the 21-year-old vote, what made the difference was we had on the referendum, on the ballot, the anti-war referendum.
Mm-hmm.
Should it be the policy of the city of Madison, da-da-da-da. That brought out a lot of students to vote.
You
And I
got that
think
on
that
by getting signatures?
I had nothing to do with that,
Mm-hmm.
but Maurice Zeitlin, Professor Zeitlin, was actively involved. Yeah, and they had circulated a petition and met the legal requirements, which got that on the ballot.
And that brought
out a lot of students to vote for register and vote for the first time, and that certainly helped. But the voter turnout was still very low.
in that particular district.
Yeah, I can't remember. For the district, relative to past years, it was very high. But compare it to a citywide basis, it was still low. And it really wouldn't start growing for another until about 70 or 71.
Did the students in the dorms vote for that?
Some did. It was very hard, though, because it was like finding a needle in a haystack, which was to find students in the dorms who were 21. The only dorms that were in the 8th district at that time were the southeast dorms. I remember there were a couple of floors set aside for graduate students at the time. And so I think I concentrated there. But most of the students over 21 were living in the apartments in the district, which included the whole West Washington, West Mifflin, West Johnson Street area, and then crossing State Street, the whole Gilman and Henry and Langdon Street areas.
And this all took place, your first election to the council was a couple of years after Dow?
July 19th.
And this is the second interview with Paul Soglin. And we will pick up from where we were last time, except that I'd like to ask him to clarify one thing from the earlier tape, and that has to do with the famous case, that became a famous case of Soglin against Kaufman, when at the time the university troubled. I don't think that was quite clear in the other tape, where that case came from.
Right. Got it?
No?
There, that clicked in. Okay. In that period of the 65, 66, and early 67, there had been a number of court cases dealing with a question of chilling effect by government officials in regards to people's free speech. And the basic premise or thrust of those cases had been that if people had planned to do something that was illegal and a constitutionally protected right, such as peacefully demonstrating or expressing themselves in one way or the other, and someone in authority had threatened them with reprisal if they carried out those constitutionally protected activities. The courts had been agreeable to issuing orders before the event saying we will not allow that. We will not allow these threats to have a chilling effect on these people's right of free speech and expression. So what had happened is prior to the Dow demonstration, I think it was actually several weeks prior to the demonstration, Dean Kaufman warned that if students were to participate in the demonstration and do certain activities, that they would be subject to discipline and suspension, possible expulsion, and in some instances the discipline would take place, would go into effect without a hearing, and then the student would have a right to appeal.
Student could request readmission.
Right.
And have a hearing.
So it was possible, for example, that a student might be carrying on a completely protected activity on some nonviolent form of free speech, that it violated the terms of what Kaufman had set down, that the university would then discipline the student, and the student, of course, would then be subject to that discipline until the student appealed, and if the student was fortunate enough, was reinstated or whatever. So there were a number of us who feared that we'd be participating in protected...
Excuse me just a second. Were you at that time, were there demonstrations in the works? Had the announcement been made that Dow was coming to the campus?
Yes. At that point, everyone knew that Dow was coming October, whatever it was, 15th, 16th, and 17th, and that there were going to be some demonstrations. Yeah, that had been known, I think, at least since late August or early September. I know when it was first known. It was first known generally by students when the registration issue of the Cardinal came out. Because the registration issue of the Cardinal contained a list of all the campus recruiters who were scheduled for the coming semester. And Dow was listed as coming in mid-October.
Had Dow been subject to demonstrations elsewhere?
Dow had been subject to some demonstrations elsewhere and had been subject to a demonstration here in Madison the previous spring.
Oh.
And the demonstration, I think it was in May of '67, except for 2 or 3 small incidents involving 2 or 3 people, had been a demonstration that was within the law. Students picketed, students did things that were within the First Amendment. There'd been an instance or two where some students had laid down behind a vehicle, a police vehicle, at the site of one of the demonstrations. And there'd also been an instance or two where students had picket signs inside of the campus buildings.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the university rules is you couldn't have a sign inside a building. And it was these kinds of things that we were concerned about. For example, did free speech mean you could have a picket sign in front of inside a building? And we were concerned, what if somebody did have such a sign and were automatically disciplined? And that's where we thought that there'd be a chilling effect, given what Dean Kaufman had said. The same thing's true, even to a certain degree, in terms of a peaceful sit-in. That if a peaceful sit-in took place, perhaps the student might be subject to some kind of a civil action in terms of a disorderly conduct charge, misdemeanor, a small fine, but that didn't necessarily mean that the university was in a position to add additional penalties. So, keeping all this in mind is what led us to go seek out Percy Julian and ask him to file an action which basically said Dean Kaufman's statements have a chilling effect, and to, in effect, get the university restrained from taking any actions to discipline students or even to threaten them for any constitutionally protected rights. Well, then, once the suit was filed, then came the demonstrations, and then following that, I believe the suit was amended, the pleadings were amended, because at that point now some students were subject to discipline.
They had actually expelled some students?
I don't know that anyone was expelled, because I think by that time we might have gotten a temporary order. I really have little recollection of the exact sequence of court decisions and what orders were issued during that whole period, other than the final opinion, which several times I had to read for law school classes.
Yeah, it's the famous case.
So other than that, I'm really not good on those details, except to say that I think we were quite pleased with the results, because from the beginning, when the action was first filed, through the various hearings, and through the various appeals, the courts consistently said you can't have a chilling effect on people's rights to express themselves.
Just because they're students.
Yeah. So,
there was a lot of talk in those days about double jeopardy.
well,
About if you were arrested by the Madison police, as
that
well
was-
as the university police.
that was the other thing. One thing that did get clarified was that certainly if a student was arrested off the campus of something not related to campus activity, the university generally was not in a position to discipline the student. Part of the problem was that university regulations, through the state administrative code, actually have the force of law. And so if a student was doing something on campus, they could be arrested, for example, for, say, disorderly conduct or what's the other charge that was oftentimes used? Unlawful assembly. And at the same time, might be in violation of a half a dozen different university rules and regulations. During that period, following October '67, one thing I think I'm comfortable in saying is that I don't think that became a problem the way it was prior to October '67. Most students who got in trouble were not subject to the double jeopardy problem. Usually, the matter was simply left to be handled in the courts, and I think only in the most extreme instances did the university take action against students.
Actually, a university expulsion was a much more serious deprivation for a student than a $50 fine or 10
Exactly.
days in jail.
Exactly. I think the university in that period might have taken action against a handful of students, perhaps suspending them. Students that were found to have been involved in destruction of university property. And even then, it was only when it was a threat, how can I put this, to academic property as opposed to non-academic property. Pushing over a wastebasket or pushing over a police car was not as serious as disrupting classrooms and disrupting notes, research notes, or whatever.
Yeah, we used to talk in those days about the community of scholars, this fragile thing that was being destroyed, but it's quite clear. When the smoke cleared, the university was about exactly the same as it had ever been, and it was the students that had made the adjustments.
And, you know, going back to when the Army Math Research Center was bombed, Mr. Fosnack lost his life, a building was destroyed, and for 3 or 4 researchers, 5-10 years of research was lost. And I think to this day, at least in terms of the destruction of the building and the destruction of the researchers' work, a greater loss is felt for the loss of the researchers' work than for the destruction to the bricks and the mortar, which could be replaced. That's in terms of those two losses. I don't think there's any comparison at all in terms of the loss of life. But
that has, it seems to me, the bombing has got the reputation, I think, unwarranted as being the end. I mean, because of the bombing, everybody turned it off. It seemed to me that the movement was in a major state of change before that bombing ever occurred.
I completely agree with that. Well, my feeling is that the bombing was, the years are a blur. The bombing, I believe, was in August of 1970. And actually, I think that the roots of the change were already beginning in the summer of 1968 at the Democratic Convention. What started happening in '68, and certainly by 1969, was that the anti-war movement, several things were happening. One, it was growing by leaps and bounds. It was geometrically increasing in size. And the anti-war movement didn't know how to deal with that. Those who had gotten involved in '63, '64, '65, up through about '66 and '67, were subject to a very long, drawn-out educational process. A lot of meetings. I remember meetings that would go on for 3-4 hours arguing over a paragraph in a statement or one sentence, how to word it. And a great deal of discussion. And because of that, people were, one, they'd gone through it for a long period of time, and secondly, there was a very high level of education about the issue and about the process. When more people became involved starting in 68 and 69. First, that educational component was lost. It was simply too difficult and too cumbersome to have a meeting with 3,000 or 4,000 students. It was hard enough when it was 150.
Well, you'd have to include congressmen and senators
yeah.
and other people that are suddenly aware of it.
And so that depth, while the size increased, the depth began to diminish. The other thing is that new people joining in were really not as patient. They were ready to move now, and so what ended up happening is that movement became one-dimensional. The only way it could express itself was in demonstrations. All the aspects of discussion and education and so on were lost. Yeah, there were no more teach-ins, for example. That's a perfect example. And so what happens by the late 60s and 1970 is a lot of people realized that the options were very limited. And a great number of people realized that the demonstrations were accounting for very little, and so they were just they weren't dropping out, but they were no longer participating. Well, this educational component had long since disappeared, except for several years. And so for just a few individuals, there was that sort of ultimate step which involved violence. And
many of those people would never have dreamed in their wildest dreams that they would be doing the things they did.
I remember talking with Rena Steinzer right after the bombing. She was editor of the Cardinal at the time. I remember her saying, well, all of us at some point or another have talked about things like this, and our imaginations have run wild. She said she had to ask herself, what did she think of it? And she said what it came down to was she asked herself the question as to whether or not she could have done it. And she said no, that was beyond her limits, that her morals and sense of value said no, that's the wrong thing to do. And I think that process had already been taking place. And what I think of is sort of like a pot that's boiling, and you turn the flame off. But for a while, it's still going to be boiling.
A little turbulence.
Yeah. And in effect, the flame had either been, I don't know if it was completely turned off, but the source of energy had been already lowered considerably by 1970. And I completely agree that the bombing does not mark a turning point as much as it's actually a period at the end of what had already been happening. So.
Well, you maintain, and I believe you, that you never were expelled or disciplined by the university, and yet you had the reputation of being the leader of a violent and dreadful. Were you subject to any physical violence yourself?
Well, in the Dow demonstration I was. In the Dow demonstration, I was one of the students who was sitting in the corridor, and I got beaten pretty handily when the police came in that corridor. Our problem was that we were trapped. Excuse me, because the corridor was probably about 12, 14 feet wide, stuffed with students. And at the back door was just a regular 2.5 foot wide door. And the police were coming down the front of the corridor. And you just couldn't get all these students. And as I've said before, what was so amazing to me was I was well back in the corridor. And in just the shortest period of time, it seems to me that I was in the front row. Everybody in front of me had disappeared.
You were counting on it.
And I didn't know how I found myself in the front so quickly. But other than that, I was arrested for, what was I arrested for? For failure to obey a lawful order of a police officer, which was a traffic offense. That was for being in my car and trying to drive through a street that the police contended was open to traffic, but wouldn't let me drive through. And the other time I was arrested was, I had already talked to the police captain, He said, you stay right here on this corner and don't move, and everything will be all right. He said, you can just stand here and observe. I said, okay. Well, he got called away for something, and another officer came along. I tried to explain to him what was Captain Mickelson who I'd been talking to. Captain Mickelson said, and he didn't seem to want to listen. The next thing I knew, I was arrested for unlawful assembly. That was eventually dismissed.
You were assembling with just yourself? Or was
Oh, yeah, that was the interesting part about it. I was standing all by myself.
By then you had the reputation of being a leader of a group.
So that's, those are the kinds of things that got me in trouble.
Of course, the police, I think, have learned a great deal. They,
Well, the change in the police department is just extraordinary.
I remember when Carlton Armstrong was brought back from Canada, and the crowd gathered in the street out here, and the chief stood in the door with his full uniform on, all alone and unarmed, and let the people in.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas 10 years before, everybody had been there with their billy clubs and their masks and their canisters, and it would have fomented more trouble than they prevented.
Since the time I became mayor, I eventually became friends with some of these officers. And it's interesting. With some of them, we never said a word about what happened in the 60s and the early 70s, but even in the silence, I think there's kind of understanding one another. Some of the other officers and I have directly talked about it, and I think it's truly a situation where on both sides, for the vast majority of people, everyone was sort of a victim of a system that didn't work.
Yes. It had never been tested in this way.
If the political process had been responsive, none of this would have happened. On the one side, you had people who saw the political process failing them, and the president going outside of the law and finding themselves with little recourse but to do the same. And then on the other side, you had the officers who, in terms of really substantial numbers of them, were put in a position of defending law and order in a situation which was not their making, which they didn't want to be in, and which their sympathies in many instances lay with the demonstrators, but they certainly weren't in a position to say no to their careers or whatever. Instead, they would try and find alternatives to some of the methods that were being used, which oftentimes created more violence or led to violence itself. There were, of course, some officers who actively relished and enjoyed the role that they played, whether it was using force in the streets or it was doing undercover work, or even in some instances, I think, were trying to encourage students to do violent things, to set them up. Those officers, I think, were at a minimum. But the ramifications of their activity were considerable.
Yes, they got exaggerated.
So,
but it is a different world now. And then I was thinking about these concerts in the Capitol Square, and these beautiful evenings, and there's a police chief lying on the grass with his wife and his bicycle there, and perfect relaxation.
yeah.
Not a uniform in sight anywhere. Everybody has seeming to have a very good time.
That's
10,000 of them.
It's a big change. 12 years ago, if 10,000 people had been on the square, one would have to just assume that there was a problem.
That's right. And they would have to call in not only our own cops, but those from all the neighboring places that they could gather, and the National Guard. Well, that brings us up to date again. When we last spoke, I think one of the things that came out as I listened again to the tape was that when you were elected mayor, you had been 5 years on the board, on the council. You were a city official for a long time. It wasn't just this young hippie that came in and took over the city, that you had paid your dues for a long time beforehand. I think a lot of people forget the time sequences and how much you had spent on the city. But we were talking at the last about your visit with Bob Brennan to Oscar Mayer, and that was the story we're going to start with. Was this shortly after you became mayor?
What had happened was, let me just put in a little framework. When I was first elected, I decided that my goal was to implement the programs I wanted to see in the city and to be the best administrator, because that was going to be the real test for my critics. They just couldn't imagine how I could run the city government. And so the first thing I wanted to do was to get everyone's confidence. And it meant, in terms of my supporters, having them, in effect, hold off for a year. And so for the first year, we made very few changes, and I did very little to change the direction of city government. I just wanted to prove to people that I could run the city. And then in the second year, and it was with my second budget, that we started implementing a lot of the programs and making the changes. And by that time, I had got the confidence of enough of the public and the political center of the council, that they were willing to say, okay, we'll vote for these changes in the budget and let you give you a chance.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to do was at least show to the business community that while I wasn't going to roll over and play dead and drop some of the things that we had talked about, there was still going to be tough environmental standards in the city, that there was still going to be a planning process which said that a developer couldn't just walk in the door, plunk down their $5 for a permit, and then just build without looking at the ramifications or the cost to the city. I want to make it clear that in terms of talking about problems and dealing with problems, that, in fact, I guess my door was open. So, well, Bob Brennan and I never got along too well. Bob was now made the head of the Chamber of Commerce. We embarked on a little program of about once a month getting together and going out and visiting a Madison business. I remember we'd gone out to Rayovac, and there was a major problem there because two sides of the plant are on residential streets. One side is off towards Kroger's and had poor access, and the third was on the end of Winnebago as it went into East Washington, and it was a terrible problem for their trucks. And it was creating problems for the neighbors, and the Rayovac people weren't happy. And we said, we sat down and met with them, and as a result of that, we ended up improving this little side street, helping Rayovac redesign its parking lot, and everybody was happy. We got the trucks off the residential streets. We provided Rayovac with a way into its plant and a way to better use its parking lot, and so on. And
had Rayovac assumed that there was no point? I suppose a lot of business people, no point in talking to you because you're
Rayovac had the problem for years, and they just really hadn't been thinking about it. And the whole thing was really prompted by the fact that some of the residential neighbors had complained. And Rayovac was living with the situation, and if they drove over some of the residential lawns, people had been living with it, they weren't particularly concerned, and they thought it was a big deal to get this street fixed up, and it ended up costing probably about $75,000, $100,000 to fix it up. But that's what city government does.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this was then followed up with a meeting to Oscar Mayer, and after a tour of the plant, we just kind of sat down, and we'd had some very substantial disagreements with Oscar Mayer, and I say we, I mean the city as a whole, mostly dealing with sewage waste and
the smell.
And the odor, and the city trying to deal with regulating what was going on in the plant as it affected the surrounding area, and the tremendous impact that the waste Oscar Mayer was having on the Madison Metropolitan Sewage District. And that had really brought the whole of the city head to head with Oscar Mayer. So as we were finishing our meeting, I said, we're aware of this, our constant disagreements about how the sewage should be handled and how it should be treated and what the costs and charges should be. So, but, is there anything else relative to the city? Are there things that we can work on? And the Oscar Mayer official that we were meeting with said, well, there are maybe one or two things. He pointed out that kitty corner from Oscar Mayer was Demetral Field, and there were a couple of tennis courts there, and they were not particularly well maintained, and some of the employees like to go over there either on their lunch hour or after work and play a little tennis. And the other thing he noted was that their parking lots driveway was about 100 feet, 200 feet from the intersection of Packers Avenue and Commercial there, 113, and that the timing sequence, so their driveway was real close to the lights at the intersection.
Is this the intersection of Commercial Avenue and whatever that street on
113, yeah.
Airport Road?
So what would happen is there'd be a long string of cars bottled up in the parking lot. So maybe 2 or 3 of them would get out into the street, and the light would change to red for them, so nobody else could get out, because they were now backed up past the beginning of the driveway. Then the light would turn green, and they would move, but at the same time cross-traffic would come across, so the people were still stuck in the driveway. So it was taking them the longest period. All right, so they'd be all bottled up in there, and it was creating problems for everybody. It wasn't good for the city. It wasn't good for Oscar Mayer. I was not aware of any of this. So I said, well, have you said anything to the transportation people? And they said, well, when they first rebuilt the intersection, and I think that must have been sometime in the late 60s, they said they'd mentioned something to someone in the city traffic engineering office, but nothing had come of it, and so they just dropped the whole thing. And I said, okay, well, we'll take a look at it. And so, of course, I went back to the office and I talked to our transportation people. And, I was convinced that since those lights were controlled by computers, there was something that could be done to ease that flow of traffic. And at least at the time that the shifts were changing, change the sequence of the lights, which eventually is what was done. But the thing that kind of amazed me was that here's Oscar Mayer, the single corporate giant here in Madison, and they had made this one request and it had gone ignored or unanswered, and same thing with the tennis courts. They'd never mentioned that to anyone. And by the way, I called up the parks people and said, look, just take a little better care of the tennis court over by Oscar Mayer at Demetral Field. And I saw some humor in a way, because I thought of all these people, literally hundreds, if not thousands of Madisonians, the everyday people that make up this city, who, if they want a stop sign at the corner near their house, or if they want a swing fixed in the neighborhood park, or whatever, will mount a massive campaign, keep the pressure on, go to committee meetings, yell and scream at their aldermen, go to the city council meeting, write letters to the mayor, go to the newspapers, launch this mammoth, gigantic frontal assault on City Hall until they get their stop sign. And here's Oscar Mayer, like a little bunny rabbit, being timid, making a humble request, and then just not following through on it. And
I suppose they are assuming if they became a complaining constituent, that the city would say, you know,
Well, this
we'll,
is-
we'll really get after your smell.
This
or
is
we'll-"
something that I was to learn in discussing this with people, was that Oscar Mayer was very concerned. They did not want to become an issue in the city. They already were concerned enough about this issue over the odor and the sewage treatment facility that they like to keep a low profile and not be involved in city politics. And yet there's all these people who are always going around and saying, you know, we are the little people, we have no influence, it's all the corporations and the big businesses that control government and everything, which certainly some truth to that, but at least in this one instance, they indicated they're far more powerful. So anyway, that to me, I don't know later on what that was to do in terms of Oscar Mayer's participation in the Civic Center. But when Oscar Mayer did get involved with the Civic Center and the private fund drive, it's really the first time in any kind of major way they ever became involved with civic activities here in Madison. Most of their philanthropic and foundation-related activities have usually been in the area of health and children. And this is the first time they had done anything directly here in Madison of really any size. Well, that was kind of, though, a reflection of part of the problem with business here in Madison. There was sort of, again, a situation of extremes where either business felt that there was no role for it, and just stay on the sidelines and don't get in anybody's way, and that way you won't get trampled either, or the other extreme, which was to go in there and fight on everything. I think that over the years, one of the things that we tried to do was provide certainty. That was very important to me, that maybe we had rules and standards that people didn't like. Reports had to be filled out, applications had to be filled out, and whatever. But at least if it was done, people knew what would happen next, how the process worked. And that was one of the things I tried to do with the business community, say, maybe you don't like all the hoops we make you jump through, but what we are going to do is we're going to tell you what those hoops are and tell you that when you jump through all of them, you get a prize at the end. You'll get your permit or your application or your variance or whatever it is that you need. We will bring certainty to your lives. And it's been a long time, but I think, as I told Mayor Sensenbrenner, that given what happened while I was in office and then what's happened when Joel Skornicka was in office, that now he's in a position really to capture the best of both worlds. And maybe these kinds of conflicts within Madison, while they won't be resolved, will at least be lessened in terms of their intensity.
Would you like to talk for a minute about the Civic Center? That was a
Well, the
37-year
Civic-
fight that had been going on.
I didn't know what I knew what I wanted to do. I didn't know whether or not I'd be able to meet the commitment. But I was bent on doing one thing, and that was being the mayor who ended the controversy on the Civic Center.
Which had been a tri-generational thing.
Yeah, I mean, controversy was old before I was born.
Yes, there really was.
And my choice was Lake Monona site. I also was relatively skeptical about the possibility of it being built. So there were a lot of people who are now pushing for the possibility of a new site over on State Street. My feeling was...
Where did that impetus come from? You know, is that just a miscellaneous?
It partially
group?
came from the State Journal, and it partially came from the Central Madison Council of the Chamber of Commerce, and some people in the business community.
They were
And there were also
anxious to
some
get it
arts groups.
Mhm.
Once this had been put forward, there were some arts groups who wanted it simply because they felt that the Lake Monona, the right design, would never be built. So my thought on it was, I preferred the Lake Monona site. I was skeptical myself, but I figured we could never, the controversy on the one site was bad enough. If we got into a controversy on two sites, it was going to be a disaster. So I figured that the thing that we had to do was deal with the Monona site. And what I wanted to do was get a commitment from everybody that, you know, we didn't affect that, and that the supporters of one side or the other would support whatever was successful. I told the people who supported the State Street site that I wanted them to give the Lake Monona site one more chance, and that if there was public support for it, that I expected them to help us develop the Monona site. That, and I told them at the same time that if the Monona site failed that test, that I would be the first person to come over and support the State Street site. Well, one thing was clear on the Monona site, which is that we needed a substantial amount of money, more than we had, and so we decided, well, let's deal with this very simply. Let's talk about raising some more money in a public referendum. And in that instance, if we get a favorable vote, we not only get confirmation that there's sufficient support for Monona, but also we've got the money to do it. And so we launched a campaign, and I can't remember what the vote was, but Lake Monona site failed. I said, okay.
Was that a referendum?
It was a referendum, yeah.
In the spring election?
It was a referendum, and it would have been in, was it spring of '74? It's either the spring of '74 or the fall of '75. I have a feeling it was a spring election. It probably was the spring of '74. So I said, okay, let's go do State Street. So now we went to work on State Street, and the owners of the Capitol Theater, RKO, had already indicated an interest in selling. The university, through Wharf, had already purchased the old Montgomery Ward's building. So I felt that the one thing that we needed to do was something decisive. I figured if I could get the support for it, I wasn't going to be sticking my neck too far into the noose. So I got the city council to agree to buy the old Ward's building. So now we have the Ward's building. Now we've got an empty building. Nothing else. We don't have any plans. We don't have any architects. We don't have a Capitol Theater or anything. Next, I got the city council to agree to authorize, I can't remember how much it was, it was $600,000, I think, for the purchase of the Capitol Theater. And this was very hard doing business, because when the seller knows how much money you've got, I said, well, if that's how much you've got, then that's what I'll take.
That's what they charge.
And that was a very interesting negotiating session.
Is RKO a national corporation that
Yeah,
owns
it was.
these-
Owns a number of theaters.
owns title, has
In fact, they
title to
still
the
may own the Majestic here in Madison. They did at the time. So we went out to see Matty Poland, who was the president. Now, some of the
President of RKO?
Yeah. 2 years earlier, some Madison business people had gone out there to talk to him on their own. And he hadn't been too pleased, because, as he said it, all I heard from them was talk, and there wasn't any money, and nothing happened, and don't come to see me unless you've got a check. So I
Nice
went
fellow
down.
to deal with.
Yeah. I went down to the treasurer's office, and I said, well, I've got authorization here for $600,000. Give me a check for $50,000. So we went out to see Mr. Poland. It was Michael Duffy and George Nelson and myself. We sent George out sightseeing because he'd been one of the original visitors, and Mr. Poland wasn't too pleased with him. We got into his office and we just kind of talked politely.
This is in Los Angeles?
New York. We talked politely and everything, and he was just about ready to throw us out of his office because all we're doing is talking and making some comments about he had to have money, and you guys just talk, and I've been waiting around for 2-3 years now. So at that point, I pulled out of my pocket the check made out for $50,000 payable to RKO. I said, here's our money, here's our down payment. And with that, the sparkle came into his eyes, and he knew he was on the verge of striking a deal. So now the problem was money. And he knew we had $600,000. And I knew that I would get lynched in Madison, that if I paid $600,000, people would say, you gave him the most. Of course, I've been left in this terrible position. So, and I explained to him, I said, look, I don't care what the city council's authorized. I don't care about any of that. The point is, I've got to strike a deal here with you, and I'm not going to do it for $600,000. Now, I've got $50,000 here, and I'm willing to give you $450,000 more at $500,000, and that's it. And he kept holding out for more, and make a long story short, finally what he ended up proposing was that we pay $550,000, and that RKO would buy 2 tickets to the opening of the Civic Center at $25,000 apiece, so that in the long run our net cost was $500,000. So he got $550,000 for the property, and then of course had a tax-deductible donation to the city of $50,000, which came a couple of years later. And of course, he had the use of the money and the interest and everything, but
So it's a good deal.
I think it was a good deal.
What year was this you're talking about?
Boy, this would have been, I guess, 75. Probably the fall of 75.
Prices of property have changed a good deal since then.
I really don't remember. It's all a blur.
That's all right.
So now we had 2 buildings. And that was it. But then the process started, and while it took a couple of years till we actually started construction, the construction didn't start until I was about to leave office. I think it was around 78 or 70, sometime in my last term we started construction. We got the architect, and we started work, and I guess the opening was in March of 1980. March of 80. So it's not the project that was my first choice. It wasn't the project that was a lot of people's first choice. But I do believe to this day we never would have gotten the Lake Monona project built. And if we hadn't done what we did at the time, we probably wouldn't have it now, because prices would have gone up, while the amount of money we had in the fund for the Civic Center wouldn't have gone up that much.
It seems to be taking hold, too, right?
It's taking hold. It's had some rough times. There's been some mistakes made, but
Everybody was new at the business.
yeah. So I'm pleased with that. I was just telling somebody the other day, though, that probably one of the 2 most satisfying things that I did while I was in office, one was the bike path around Lake Monona, and the other was getting the railroad crossing repaired at West Washington Avenue. Those are the things that just seem to be impossible to get done, and they're not very big. And it's been years now since that West Washington crossing's been repaired. But that was a real headache.
Yeah, well, it was a dreadful crossing, and it is nice bouncy little rubber cover now. Well, and as you look back on it, what was the other than the crossing at West Washington Avenue, the major changes that took place while you were mayor? And there are a number of those, I think, aren't there?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that physically happened, but they all were part of a theme of trying to instill a belief that economically the city could work, and that at the heart of that there had to be a functioning, active downtown. that public transit could work, that we didn't have to clog up our streets with cars, and that was expanding our bus system, and then the work on the State Street Mall and the Capitol. And it's going to take a long time, but I really believe that we will slowly begin to increase our housing supply downtown. And when that starts to happen, it's going to make the businesses downtown more viable. And it's also throughout the city going to make us more family-oriented than we've been in the last 8 or 10 years, where Madison's population is basically getting older. Families with children have been living in greater proportions out in the county than they are in the city. And I think we've managed to turn that around, and that in the next 5 to 10 years, we will, I don't think we'll ever see the number of families in Madison that we had in the post-World War II era, but it'll at least get to the point where it's stable. It means our school enrollments will hopefully stop declining. In fact, I just saw some projections the other day that says another 3-4 years, at least in terms of entry level for grammar school, we're going to actually have an increase in school population.
Considering the necessity of opening the Latin school.
I mean, I think that is so exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the kinds of things that, trying to look 20, 30 years into the future. And the other thing is the recreational activities. I can't remember the numbers, but something like 1 out of every 8 adults in the city plays softball.
Thousands.
It's just incredible how that program has developed in the last 10, 15 years. I don't even know how many softball diamonds we've got, and I don't know how many umpires the recreation department provides. But it's just phenomenal. And when you think about it, here's a kind of activity that virtually everyone can participate in. The expense for what people get out of it is relatively small. I think on some of those softball diamonds, they're running 3 games a night, 6 nights a week.
We have parking problems around
Yeah,
a lot of them.
and-
You can't
and-
find a place to
Yeah, parking
stop.
is our major problem. And, I guess I get very excited about Madison sometimes.
Well, the downtown, it seems to me, what is happening in Madison, what probably is, it'll happen other places, is that you no longer have to have a lot of stores downtown to have an active downtown. You can bring people down, people will come if there's activity of other kinds, and we've certainly seen the development of that kind of thing.
I don't think we'll ever see another Sears or a Ward's or a Manchester's back downtown. Downtown stores are going to be the smaller ones. But when we look at these activities like the way the art show on the square has grown, and now there's this new program of the concerts, and there's the farmers market which runs from May through October.
And the movies.
It's just incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going to be downtown of the 1940s and 50s, but it's certainly not going to be the downtown that we had. Just everything went wrong for downtown in the late 60s between the demonstrations and just the economic problems.
I can remember one evening when we were unexpectedly downtown, my husband and I, he had a jury out, and I came down at dinner. We walked all around the square, and there was one restaurant open, the top of the park was the only place where we could go to eat. Now there are any number of places where you can get a good meal, and they're all busy and expensive, but people seem to have the money. Well, do you think that any of this has to do with Madison itself? The character
Well,
of the
I
place?
think, I do. What's interesting to me is we've got a lot of people from big cities living in Madison, mostly attracted here some way through the university, people from Chicago, New York, Milwaukee. They come to Madison, and they want very rural and very pastoral settings for their lives. And then we got a lot of people from rural Wisconsin who want to see Madison being sophisticated and urbane. And it's interesting because I don't know if we're a big little city or a little big city, but on the one hand, for a city as small as we are, we have an awful lot going on in terms of recreation, leisure, culture, and so on. And we've got activities here that a lot of cities with 1 million people or more don't have. At the same time, there are very few cities as large as Madison, where from downtown, in most directions, you can drive in only 20 minutes and be in the middle of nothing but pastures and fields. And as long as we've got these two forces kind of tugging at one another, I think it's real healthy for us, and that's what kind of makes Madison special. And there's other cities that people compare to Madison on occasion. Cities either with about our size, or they've got a state university, or maybe a state university and a capital. Two that come to mind immediately are Columbus, Ohio, and Austin, Texas. I think Austin, Texas has done a lot of what we have done. But I still think that it's real hard to find a community, a city our size, that's got that balance. And I think what happens is for native Madisonians, they're raised with it as kids, that they're kind of filled with the notion that it's their city and that they can have something to say about it. And for people who end up migrating to Madison, they come here for that specific reason. I mean, I've run into so many people in the last 5-6 years who say that they very carefully decided where to move and picked Madison. These aren't people who got transferred here or assigned here, had to move here because somebody said that. I can think of one couple I know quite well. He is working for the city and she works for the university. They sat down one day, they lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and they decided they wanted out of Cleveland, they wanted something better. And they spent one whole year researching this whole country. Job opportunities, environment, where to raise children, and so on. And they picked Madison. Once they selected Madison, they started coming here visiting, looking for jobs, which they eventually found, and moved here. I don't know that everybody spends a whole year researching the whole United States.
Kids, you can't afford it.
Yeah, and they did have the money to do that. But in any case, I do think a lot of people just deliberately make that decision. The fellow that I was talking about with the mailbox problem. Now he's out in Lone Rock where he had a summer home. He's now retired. He's had a business in Chicago all these years, which he's finally sold. And that's it. He decided he wanted to come up to the Madison area. And now they are looking, which proves that retirement doesn't always work, they're now thinking, well, maybe they'd like to start a small business somewhere.
Start working
And
20 hours
so,
a day.
yeah, so now they're looking around, even downtown Madison, possible thought of buying a small business. Yeah, I don't know.
Now, I've always thought, maybe you agree, that one of the characteristics of Madison, one of the things that's produced this, is that we've had clean government here forever. The state of Wisconsin has been clean.
When I was in Boston, teaching at Harvard, it was the time of one of the telephone scandals where some of our public officials have been caught making those $20 worth of personal phone calls. And people in Boston were just amazed.
You know, the people are really indicted for.
Someone could get in trouble for making a few phone calls.
Well, I think when people take jobs for the city or the university or the state, come to Madison, they have a tendency to consider themselves permanent. They buy
Yeah.
property, they settle down and
Yeah.
become part of the community.
I don't think there's any question. That's one thing Wisconsin's always has, an extremely clean government.
And it gets a lot more
That's-
for its bucks.
Yeah.
Everything.
I remember at one point when I was campaigning, I think it was the last campaign in 1977, we had a coffee out on the far west side, and people were paying some pretty hefty property taxes out in the Parkwood Hills area. And we got into a discussion about property taxes, and somebody said they thought those were kind of high. And somebody else, a university professor, said, yes, they are. He says, I don't care. He says, I do care that the money's well spent, but as long as it's well spent. And then he started saying, you know, how much you paid in property taxes to the city and the county and the school district and so on, and then started talking about the services that he was receiving from all these governmental agencies. And he said something like, if they want another $200 or $300 from me next year, as long as they continue to give me that kind of service, I'll pay it.
People that have lived elsewhere all know that, and teachers that have taught elsewhere and come to Madison realize what a remarkable organization they have to work with.
I don't think our level of property taxes could survive in some other cities where the level of service is so much lower. There's no question that we're on the high end, but I guess it just proves that while nobody likes to pay taxes, people are less grudging about it if they feel it's being well spent.
Our friends that raise their families in New York, for instance, have paid cash money for all the things that we take for granted in raising a family in Madison. The parks, the recreation, the school expense. And
That's something that's very important, in that I really do believe that and we have no way of measuring it either, but that we actually save a lot of money, and I think it's important people look at it that way, that because the level of service is that high, it does mean that we are not required to spend other dollars. Other states, people may pay $600, $800, $1,000 a year, for example, for auto insurance. Here, people may pay for the same auto $250 or $200 a year, and that's because we've got fewer accidents, we have safer streets, we've got better control over crime, and how do you put a value on that? And that's, or just the well-being of knowing that you can walk around the square.
not at night.
Well, at night, I think it's really changed this last year. We haven't had nearly the problems. There was a period about 2 years ago, but even the square is vastly improved.